That was really helpful. And little buried nugget in there was Sebastian's point about un.js. If you haven't looked at un.js, I don't just think it's like the most exciting project to him. I think it might be the most exciting project or collection of projects in all of JavaScript right now. It's really incredible. And some of the tools that are in there, which are powering Nuxt, are also starting to power some other like non-Vue projects. So take a look at it. We're going to talk about forms, though, and I have a lot to get through, so I'm going to get going. Clicker. OK, my clicker doesn't work. That's OK. Oh, my computer doesn't work. That's less OK. Oh, there we go. OK, so this is me. I'm Justin Schroeder, and I am a co-founder of a small agency called Braid. But really, my heart is in open source. These are open source projects that I have created. And I'm mostly going to talk to you today about FormKit, but even more so, just the general theory about forms. Now, forms are boring and not that exciting, and I know you just ate lunch, but try really hard to stick with me because I think you might get something valuable out of it. Here's what we're going to try to cover. Why are forms hard? Solutions to the hardness of the forms, and finally, we'll do a little bit of demo time. Now, there's a myth that needs to be debunked, which is floating around out there, that is basically forms are easy. How many of you work on forms in your day job as a developer? OK, so pretty much everybody. Realistically, it's just like a massive part of what we do. And that's sort of why I started getting involved in trying to write form libraries, was the fact that maybe 80% of my time was just spent working on forms. And for some reason, they were so hard. And what you hear all the time is stuff like this. Just use form data and native validation, right? And to be honest, you should do this. You should just use native form data and validation if your form is so simple that that works for you. But based on the number of hands that just went up, I know that this is not the use case for so many of you. But here's another one. The frameworks have solved forms. So there's a popular concept out there that Vue and React or Svelte have sort of solved the form problem. Ryan Florence of React, Router, and Remix fame has this quote. I don't think there should even be form abstractions. Forms are fundamentally markup, user interactions, event handlers, state management, requests between React and Remix, but I'm putting in Vue, Svelte, or React. What will a form library add here? Toss in some validation functions and be done with it. And the reality is, this is more like my life. When I work with forms, they end up becoming this giant Rube Goldberg machine that are incredibly complicated, where you're drilling props down through multiple layers of components and then trying to get the values back up. And then when there's a validation error somewhere deep down inside of there, somehow at the top level you need to know about it. And then somebody says, like, hey, we need to have more than one of those. And now you've got some sort of a repeater situation. And 2 people on your team know how to do it. And it's just horribly complicated. So forms are painful, I think. And the reason is that their concerns are much broader than just a few little interactions. You've got a ton of boilerplate code. There's a lot of little, tiny nuanced interactions that are important that UI library authors would know about. You've got accessibility, validation, a whole bunch of stuff, including things like dependent effects. So, somebody types into this field and then something happens in another field somewhere else. These things get very complicated very quickly. So what's a solution? Well, components. This is what we've learned in the Vue space, is that components are a great encapsulation of logic. And there's a lot of components out there for you to pick from. And there's more all the time. There's constantly new UI libraries coming out. And they all have their own take on this stuff. But the problem is that they really only solve a small subset of the problems of forms. They do a great job of reducing the boilerplate. They handle a lot of those nuanced interactions. They do accessibility. Some of them even get into a little bit of validation. But for the most part, you're going to be grabbing a whole bunch of NPM packages from all over and trying to clobber them together into something that works for your project. So if these are handled by components, then I would argue that the rest of this is something architectural. And we got to figure out what that is in order to try to make them better. So that's what I started doing. My first attempt was to say, well, let's just model all the data in a store. You know, that could be a Pina store or a Vuex store. And so I did this in ViewFormulate 1, which is a library I 100% know none of you have used because it hardly ever made it out of the cradle. We did this, and we had basically components, because we do need components, right? We do need components to have accessibility and all those nuanced interactions. But then we tried to handle the rest of those problems in the Vuex store. And it turns out this didn't work. All of these things do not work that well in a store. Well, some of them do, but most of them just don't work that well in a store. There were too many complex use cases. So, any other solutions? Well, components, right? We're going to do components, maybe with provide inject, so that way they can automatically sort of know where they are in the hierarchy. And so I wrote another library, ViewFormulate 2, which some of you may have used. It was kind of at the end of the Vue 2 era. And this was a lot better, except for all of this stuff. It turns out it didn't really solve any of the fundamental problems. We tried to stick it all inside of components, and it didn't really work. So in 2021, we're sitting around thinking about how, like, what is the actual solution? What is the actual problem? Why are forms so freaking hard? And then we had an epiphany. And that's what I'm going to tell you about mostly today, is sort of this moment when we began to realize why forms are hard and how to fundamentally fix them. So let's imagine that we have an API request, something like this. We've got some simple string values like name and email, then a little object of address data and some notifications, and we need to send this via an API request. So we're going to build a form for it. And our form might look something like this, right? We've got a couple of email, like an email field, a name. We've got some checkboxes down at the bottom. Now, it turns out it takes an obscene amount of just HTML to do this, right? And it's even worse if you're using Tailwind, like this example, because it's just an enormous amount of HTML. Well, fortunately, components solve this, right? And so like FormKit ships some components, which is why a lot of people get confused that we're a UI library. We're not a UI library. But a lot of people get confused about that because we do ship components. So here you can see, that's less code. But what's actually interesting is that it produces the exact structure that we need at the end of the day. No further mutations or anything else necessary. So how does it do this? Well, here's our form. I'm going to diagram this out. And we've got a couple of components. There's like the personal details and the notification settings that were below. And then underneath that, we had like a layout component and an address component. And then underneath that, we had our actual inputs. Okay, so they're a couple layers deep, but no problem. Our address does some sort of grouping, obviously, because the input, its inputs are inside of an object. And then our notification settings are also inside of one. And then the, I don't know if you remember, but the other one was an array structure. So we have some sort of a list here with more inputs. Those are the checkboxes. And remember that what we're trying to produce is this structure. Okay? So the email's down there. You can see that's an array under notifications, and address is grouped. And it's pretty cool because this matches up roughly with what you see in the component tree here. You've got your form, which is like the outer part of this. You've got some inputs like name and email, which are they're just there. You've got an address, which is doing some kind of grouping here on the input, or the streets and the cities. You've got notification settings, which are also taking in some flat data and some structured data. And in the end, you end up with something that looks roughly right. But here's the problem. Here's the aha moment. This right here. These things are not represented in any which way, shape, or form in my data, but they are represented in my component tree. And this is what took us so long to figure out. And it doesn't seem that harmful, but I promise you this is the source of most of your pain. So here's the DOM tree. These are all the DOM elements represented in that form we just looked at. This is the component tree, right? So these are the components that we just looked at. And you'll notice that they're different, but they are a direct grouping of one to the other, right? They're just more grouped. But the form tree, if such a thing existed, is different. It does not fit into these other ones. And that is the important nugget. Forms are their own distinct trees. They are their own distinct tree structures. And if we're honest about it, just like this poor little girl here who cannot figure it out and then decides to just give up, that's basically what we all do when we're working on forms and we can't get it quite right. We cut some corners. At some point, we just cut corners. We don't put the validation errors on the input where it's supposed to go. We just blob them somewhere on the page. We have alert dialogues. We toast error messages. We do all these kinds of things because getting that error message back to the place where it was supposed to go is just too hard. And interestingly, if you think about it, forms have always been distinct trees. So form data, which is the native way that you submit a form, is essentially just going down into this, finding all of the inputs that are down there, and then extracting them out. Now, this is not an interesting tree of data. It's flat, right? And this is one of the problems, one of the limitations with form data. It does a good job of saying somewhere down inside of there is my data, but it does a bad job at a lot of other stuff. For example, you can't structure anything. Everything's always flat. The keys for them are not unique. So like if you have a name key, you can have 7 names in the same thing, and there's no conflict resolution. You can't rehydrate a form. You can't fill the form back out, repopulate it using form data. So you have to somehow put that data deeply down inside of there. Native validation UX is terrible. It's terrible. And on the client service side of my business, I can tell you we've had a lot of problems with that. Where was I? You can't transport backend errors. This is another popular problem. The backend gives you some errors, and now you need to go put them somewhere. And there's no way to get them down into the locations where they need to be. You can't really impact input behavior. You know, like let's say you want an input mask or something like that. You can't do a good job of any of that using things like form data. So it has limitations. And that's why we created FormKit, because we're trying to be a form framework. This is sort of a new term that I thought up one day, and because I realized that, yeah, it's wonderful that Vue and React and all of these front-end libraries are doing such a great job of handling the rendering, but most of my time spent on forms. They deserve some sort of solution. We're not a UI library. Got it? Okay. So how does it work? Can you guys see that? Sort of? Okay. It just says FormKit type text. So when you do this in FormKit, it creates a text input, as you would imagine. But underneath the hood, it calls this little secret function, create node. And create node reveals this little node. What is a node? Well, it's like a mini application just to control that one input, okay? And you can do this for any type of input. So you can say type text area, boom, it creates another little node. But where this gets interesting is when you say something like form. And then it automatically starts to arrange itself in a tree structure without you having to do anything. So it automatically knows which inputs are inside of the form. And that means that depth is no longer an issue, right? The way that your component tree is laid out actually doesn't really matter. You can have 100 components, layout components, whatever you want in between, and you don't have to prop drill down to them. The values automatically show up there. You can rehydrate from the top of the form, and values will pop up wherever they need to be. And in fact, you can make the structure more complicated. So you could say FormKit type group, and then you could stick some inputs underneath that, and those would start to then self-organize into a tree. Or you could say type list, and these will start to self-organize into an array structure. And now this looks all technical and complicated, but if you think about it, this is actually exactly the structure that you would need for something like a blog post. Here's a title, post with some meta information. It's all pre-structured, and it goes to the right place. And if I want to put an error message on the published on date, I can do that by just saying form.meta published on, and it goes right to where it's supposed to go. So these edges in graph theory are the connections between points. They're really important. They transport the values, the validation loading state, all your touch state, the blurred state. Everything that you need to know about a form can be transported very easily. So if you want to know, are there any errors in just this sub area, it is automatically tracking that for you at any given time. Well, what else? Some other neat features. For one, it's a single component, so we're trying to replicate what HTML is doing. Everything is a form kit. You don't have to remember the 1,000 different component names that exist in UI libraries. This would just give you a text input. If you said type checkbox, it would give you a type checkbox, just like an input. If you say type select, it's going to give you a select. And then it's obviously turbocharged, just like any good component would be. So if you say options, this will automatically render an accessible field set with checkboxes inside of it, all with proper IDs assigned and ARI attributes and so on and so forth. So every single native input is included in the base list. And then it turns out being an open source library is a really bad business plan. So we're selling some pro inputs, which are basically UI library-like to try to support the project. So more complicated ones like date pickers and color pickers and all these kinds of things. Inline validation. So the validation rules for your inputs just get put directly where you're using them. And then we have another really cool feature called FormKit Schema. And my definition for that is schema is a JSON serializable data format for storing DOM structures and component implementations, including FormKit forms. So interestingly, you don't have to use this with FormKit at all if you don't want to. And let me show you roughly how this works, because I think it's pretty interesting. If, let's say we have a div with hello world, we can represent that in a schema format like this. You can say L and the children hello world. And then if you take that JSON serializable object and pass it to a FormKit schema component, it automatically renders a div. Wow, okay, why is that so interesting? Well, it's interesting because this JSON format can be stored anywhere. You can put it in a database, you can stick it on API requests, and go absolutely anywhere you want. And when it shows up at the other side, you get an actual view application rendering from it. But it's not just that. It can also represent components or FormKit inputs. All of these can just be stored in JSON. And then the most powerful feature is the fact that it supports expressions. So you can do Boolean logic in JSON. You can do arithmetic in JSON, function calls, conditional rendering, slot rendering, and a lot more. Let me give you a little demo real quick. Hopefully, live demo, right? We'll see if this works. Okay. Is that big enough? Yeah. Okay, so here you can see that this is just a little JavaScript object, but the goal here is that everything is always serializable to JSON. And I have a input being rendered, and you can see this is just being passed, this schema object is just being passed down here to the FormKit schema component. Okay? And it's rendering a form with this input in it, the number input. And I can interact with this, and it works the way you would expect. So here, I'm going to add the total price. Well, let me just start by adding the price. So the value of my form, because everything is self-organized into a tree, is available to me at any place underneath that tree. So right here, I can access value, and it'll actually render the value of my entire form, which in this case is just an object. That's not very helpful. So let's get the value dot quantity. Okay. And now you can see that this is an actual live reactive chunk of view that is running in real time. But I can do more than that. So I could say, that's great, but I'd actually like to run this by some price. And now we're doing arithmetic right there. And this is not using eval. There's a little lightweight compiler that runs real time to make sure that this is not JavaScript. It's a small DSL on top of that, or underneath that. And if I want to format this, I can actually take values from JavaScript and explicitly pass them through. This is partially for security reasons, but also it makes it really explicit what is available to me and not. So in this case, I'm passing a reactive object here to data, and I'm passing in a function called dollars. And now that's available to me anywhere in here using, whatever my variable name was, so dollars. And now I'm actually performing a function call right there in line. So you can start to imagine ways that this would be particularly useful because you can operate with these serializable formats so easily. There's a lot of features to FormKit, like a lot. So I don't really have time to talk about all of them. There's far too many. But the point is that it's trying to be a comprehensive solution to this form problem. And that architecture, the tree architecture underneath, is what really matters. So I'm going to play with it a little bit more here, and hopefully we can start to understand it a little bit better. Okay. I have a little reminder that tries to remind me to commit because I forget so much. Let's pull this up. So I've got a little Nuxt app here, and I'm going to try to do some recipe creation, right? A little simple little recipe app. So let's take a look at what we've got here. We've got two inputs, a FormKit of type name and this FormKit of type mask, okay? And these are all nestled under a form. Now there's got a little submit handler on here, so let me go ahead and see what happens. I click that, oh, not everything is valid. It already did that, I already knew that. I didn't have to do anything other than say what should or shouldn't be valid. But my submit handler here never got called because not everything was valid on there. So let me put some garbage in there, click submit. You can see here it already knows about the loading state. Everything downstream automatically knows of the loading state. It automatically disables all the inputs. It does this for you automatically because it can and because it's good practice, but also because it's self-organized in this tree. Okay, that's pretty neat. Let me do this here. Let me see the values that are coming out. So I'm going to destructure from the default slot the value of my form input. And sure enough, here you can see this is the value of my form input, and as I interact with it in real time, it's changing. Now this is a mask right here, and FormKit's mask has a really neat feature that lets you have enum placeholders. So in this case, I can increase this. You can't see this. I'm hitting the up and down arrows, and I'm able to cycle through my enum on these. And of course, I can type, so this recipe is going to take 2 hours and 32 minutes. And our values are flowing the way you would expect them to. Okay, now sort of interesting, not that impressive. But it would be nice if I could take this and just not have it be all inline. So I'm going to go ahead and just cut that out of there. And instead, I'm going to pull up my components, and I'm going to plop it in here in this recipes field component. And then back here, I'll go ahead and use that. Okay. All right, interesting. So now you can see this is slightly more interesting. Notice I didn't do any vModel binding. I didn't pass anything through. There's no prop drilling. I just put the recipe fields as a child underneath here. And it still works. If I come in here and click submit, it still knows that that form was invalid, even though these things are now distantly away from me. That's happening because of that architecture that we were talking about, where these things are self-organizing, so we know the validity state at any time. In fact, if I come back over here to my app, instead of destructuring value, I could destructure the state. And let me just put the state information out here. So here you can see a whole bunch of stuff that it starts to automatically know about it. And the cool thing is that any groupings deeper down inside of here, it knows the state for just that subgrouping. So let's say you have an address component somewhere deep down inside of there. You can know the validity of just that little subtree. Okay, let's go back to value, and let's make it a little more interesting. So I'd like to have some ingredient fields. So here you can see I've got another component. It's got some an ingredient input, and then here we've got a number input for quantity and some units of measurement. So I'm going to include that as well. Ingredient fields. Okay, so now I've got an ingredient. Sure, I can do olive oil, some quantity. I can select something. You can see all my data is flowing properly. Okay, that's neat that I can start to kind of compose things together like that. But the problem is your boss is going to come to you and say, hey, that's ridiculous application because you can make a recipe with only one item. So you need to be able to have more than one. So I'm going to call this a repeater, FormKit type repeater. And I'm just going to wrap my ingredient fields here. And I'll give this a name of, ingredients. Okay. And now you can see we have a repeater automatically generated with the components or with the inputs that were underneath that. And if I start typing in here and we're looking at the quantities that are coming out, you can see that this is now nested inside of this repeater object. Should be called ingredients, there we go. They're automatically nestled inside this sweet, sweet little repeater, and I can just click add, and I can do more of these. I can resort, I can move them around, and my objects are automatically self-organized. So this is working, and it's working trivially without you needing to do any wiring up because of that underlying architecture which allows for this sort of structuring. There's a lot more that we could talk about there, but I am going to move on because I only have 5 minutes left. So that is a quick overview of FormKit and sort of how to use it. And I think maybe more interestingly, why forms are so hard. There is one more thing that I want to talk about. So one of the things that we've done by creating these like complex inputs is ship all of those DOM elements, right? And that means that if you have something like a date picker, let me exit here real quick, and I'm going to just pull up our playground. Okay, if I just have a date picker here, let me zoom out so I can see the HTML. So here's the HTML for this. This is a FormKit date picker. It's really cool. You can navigate it lots of different ways. It's very accessible. But if you look down here, there is an unbelievable amount of DOM that's being generated to make these kinds of things work well. And that means that it's unbelievably complicated to style these. So FormKit, from its very inception, has always been style agnostic. We have a theme that you can use, but we know that most people want to customize anyway. And our styles have always been written with semantic CSS, but so many people use Tailwind now. So this is a pain point, and it's a pain point that we've wanted to address for a while. So let me show you something that we've been working on. In fact, this is actually the first time we've ever shown anyone, so you guys are lucky. This is sort of like a big announcement. If you look over here, you can see that we have this formkit.theme.ts file. And this is how all of the styles are showing up on here. And if you take a look at the DOM, you'll see that these are Tailwind styles. And for Tailwind devs, this is really, really nice because it means, you know, any input that you have, you can just apply your own and they automatically override and so on and so forth. But it still takes a massive amount of work to create these. So today, we're announcing a new project called themes.formkit.com. And this is a complete theming library system for all of these. So there's two different themes that we're shipping today, one called Regenesis and one called Starter, which is basically to help you write your own themes. And they have an editor tab. So here you can see a specimen of every single FormKit input that ships and all of its various permutations, because when you're styling, this is one of the really hard things, is it's easy to forget, like, oh, okay, I styled that input, but I forgot the error messages. Now we're going to show you every single possible option. And not only that, right over here, you can just make changes and automatically see them be reflected. So I can increase the border radius. I can, you know, come down in here and I can change information about like the shading. I can change the max width on this. There's a lot of features. I can say, you know, hey, I'd like, you know, more shading. And the really neat thing about this is the variables that are available here are the variables that we made available, variables we made available as theme authors. So you, as a theme author, can write your own theme and say what things you want to be variable. And it'll automatically generate this palette for you here on the right-hand side. And then when you like it, you can click this button and you can download this directly to your project in the exact format that you want. But it's actually better than that because, of course, we are running FormKit right here. So I can actually just pop open a new terminal and run npx FormKit theme. And it is detecting that I had a theme file in my project. Found a local theme file for Regenesis. Do you want to edit this theme? Well, yes, I do. And now this has booted up themes.formkit with the exact configuration that we were using in our application. And you notice that it doesn't say download anymore. Now it says save changes. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to make a change. I'm going to, I don't know, increase the spacing and the font size. and I'm going to hit Save Changes. And this will actually write the theme file in your project for you automatically. If we come back over here, you can see that the styles have already gotten updated. If I change this to another color, let me move this over here. This is a live demo, so I hope it works. All right, so I'm doing red now. I click Save Changes, and you can see my local projects files got updated, and I can see the actual changes reflected right away. Get rid of the border radius. There we go. Beautiful. So that is FormKit Themes, and it's still a bit experimental right now. Works with light mode and dark mode, and it's ready to go right now. You guys can visit the site. I'm sure you'll find some edge cases and bugs, but it's available right now. So that is FormKit. Thank you very much. You can follow me on the X, I guess it is, JP Schroeder. And a shout out to View School. They did a whole course on FormKit that is a pretty good way to get started with it. So I'll be meandering around for a little bit longer if anybody has questions. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Jay Schroeder. Do you have time for one question? Yeah, one?
Yeah.
Okay, one question. Oh, we saw a hand up over here.
Thank you, great demo. I was just curious that you have the style builder, but is that possible just use totally customize the component? For example, input, select, date picker, because a lot of companies may have their own UI library. So using that component is a kind of a big change, right?
You're saying using like a third-party date picker or something like that?
Yeah, or maybe custom build.
Yes, yes, good question. Yes, you can wrap, I mean, I don't have time to do a whole demo on it, but you can wrap any third-party component in FormKit. So a lot of people do it with PrimeView or Viewtify or a bunch of these other ones. That's totally doable, yeah.
Please put your hands together again for Mr. Schroeder.